Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Mr. Bradley. I'll be your tour guide today as we are going to walk through the origins of the Cold War and other important events that are going to shape the post-war world. If you have not done so, please go ahead and pause this to set up your notebook for today. Our big guiding question is, what were the motives and methods driving the U.S. policy of containment in the post-World War II era? And a few big terms for us here: the Cold War, Truman Doctrine, Berlin Airlift, Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. So our big focus today is about the United States taking on this role trying to contain communism. You can refer to your textbook for additional information about these topics, Chapter 33, Section 1, and Chapter 33, Section 2. So where we left off from last time was with the development of this Iron Curtain that has descended across the continent. We can look here that this was not an actual curtain that was there, but it was that division point between Eastern allies and Western allies. And once that curtain went up, right, once countries were behind here, there really hasn't been a lot of evidence that they were able to get out of that. And one thing that we began to look at last block was the role that the United Nations was going to play as a means to try to deal with future aggression. This is something that Churchill and Roosevelt thought would be the tool to deal with Stalin in the years after the war. And one thing that we did learn last time is that the United Nations does have this inner circle of the Security Council, and these are the 5 permanent members. One thing that's going to happen, though, is at this time, each of the countries does have a veto power, which means that they can effectively block what UN resolution might be up for discussion. So what we can take away from that is that if there were things that were dealing with maybe that might benefit the Western Alliance, the Soviets could veto that, or something that might benefit the Eastern Alliance. This is something that the Western powers could veto as well. So basically at this point, the UN is not going to be a very effective tool at dealing with the emerging Cold War issues that are there. So looking at this cartoon, we can see the UN portrayed as kind of this smaller figure that is not powerful enough to deal with this Iron Curtain. So what this is going to mean, though, is that other countries are going to have to take on more of an independent role or a different kind of alliance as a means to deal with some of these issues. So where we're headed is this new post-war goal is to contain communism, because that is the big concern, and that was one thing that Churchill warned about, that it's not so much that these countries are red. That was certainly an issue. But the other issue is that these things could possibly expand into other areas. And so one of the big focuses is to contain communism or to keep it where it is. But also one of the motives behind this is that if nothing is done about this now, this is going to be something that's going to be more difficult to deal with later on. So really trying not to repeat some of the issues that led to the rise of Hitler and ultimately the outbreak of the Second World War. So if containment is going to become this new post-war goal, what we have to begin to look at are some of the policies that are going to really put the United States in the position of stopping the expansion of communism. In just a moment, a link is going to pop up with a little clip that I'm going to ask you to view. There will be some questions that will follow that, but it's a great introduction to where we are headed today. So the Truman Doctrine is what is going to place the United States into this position with the goal of trying to stop the expansion of communism. So Truman, again, being the president, doctrine meaning idea or principle. So this is the Truman idea or the Truman principle. So at the heart of it, we heard a little excerpt there. He says, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free people resisting attempted control by armed minorities or by outside forces." So what the United States is going to do is to assist nations that are threatened with some sort of aggression or with the threat of takeover. So going back to the map right here, with the clip that we just saw, it seemed that Turkey and Greece were really these first big hotspots of the emerging Cold War that is there. And so for a variety of reasons and issues, the United States is going to intervene to try to prevent these places from becoming red, according to the color scheme here on the map, but to try to prevent them from falling to communism. So what is this really going to look like? The United States is now going to assist nations that are resisting communism or are threatened with some sort of communist takeover. What this is going to look like and how the United States is going to assist nations. At this point, the United States is going to rely on economic aid. So $400 million, which was a lot of money in 1947. It's a lot of money today, but it was a lot of money in 1947 for the United States to give to other countries for these reasons. And so the goal of this is to bring more economic and political stability and also to minimize the appeal of communism. So when we think about the effects of the Truman Doctrine, right? Is this the declaration of Cold War? There are many historians that will make that argument because now the United States is saying that our goal is to stop your expansion, right? Or to aid nations that are the target of your expansion. This also is going to draw some controversy in the United States because this is definitely a new role that the United States is taking on when compared to its historical interventions in other countries. So is this intervention or interference, right? Are we becoming involved to help other nations, or are we interfering in their business to uphold our own goals? But also is going to lead to controversial budgets, right? The United States is going to begin to give a lot of money in the form of foreign aid as a means to contain communism. So that was also something that was a little bit of a controversy at the time. But in the long run, this is going to establish the United States, or its guiding principle anyways, for really much of the Cold War, to assist nations that are being threatened with a communist takeover. So when we look at the map, if the goal was to stop the expansion of these red areas into other ones, we can say that the Truman Doctrine effectively was successful at this point. So the Truman Doctrine is really going to kind of immediately apply to both Turkey and Greece right here. But there are also some big concerns about the rest of Europe. One thing we learned last time is that Europe was pretty much devastated as a result of World War II. You have millions of people who are displaced, who are homeless, who are unemployed, who are hungry. You have industries that lay in ruin. You have governments that are bankrupt. And so there needs to be a reconstruction plan that is going to be undertaken to try to rebuild the wartime allies, or to rebuild the rest of Europe. In just a second, we are going to view a little clip here about something that is called the Marshall Plan that really is aimed at doing just that. So as a quick recap of the Marshall Plan, the focus of this was to promote the economic recovery of Europe. Again, it is to provide food, machinery, and other types of materials. A total of $13.5 billion was given to many of these European countries to rebuild themselves after the war, but also to bring stability and to lessen the appeal of communism. This is also going to reinforce the post-war alliance system that is developing. There were a lot of strings attached to the money that was given, but also, again, with the goal of containing communism. We can look at this little graphic right here and to see which countries received money, and kind of runs right along that Iron Curtain, right, if you were to think about it like that. So it was a way to reinforce countries that could potentially become vulnerable to the expansion of communism. So we can say that, at least for now, that containment was successful here. Moving forward, we're going to pay attention to this little bitty dot, this little smudge right here. in the middle of the eastern part of Germany. That is Berlin, the capital of Germany. What we might remember from the previous blocks is that after World War II, the Allies had agreed to break up Germany into these different zones of occupation. So we have the Soviet zone, the British zone, the French zone, and the American zone. If you look carefully, you'll see this fruity pebble looking thing right here that this is actually Berlin. You'll notice that it is also broken up or divided among the Allies. Stalin resents the Western Alliance's presence right smack in the middle of his sector of Germany. Remember, Germany was kind of a sore spot, right, between the wartime alliance. Stalin wanted to keep Germany weak. The other allies wanted to strengthen Germany. One of the sayings of the time is what happens to Germany happens to the rest of Europe. And this would provide an important buffer against the expansion of Soviet policies into Europe. So to take this a step further, the economic recovery of Germany was not going very fast, right? And the Allies were suspicious that Stalin was kind of doing things purposefully to slow down that recovery. So as a result of this, what the Allies are going to do is they're going to merge their zones together and form a whole new country out of that, which is the Federal Republic of Germany. It was oftentimes just referred to as West Germany. When the Allies did this, Stalin views this as maybe a hostile act by the Allies in moving against the Soviets. And so he is going to respond in a way that is going to create one of the first real, confrontations of the Cold War. What Stalin is going to do is he is going to blockade Berlin or blockade the Allied sectors of Berlin, meaning that there's no food or fuel or accessibility to get supplies or anything else into the Berliners. We'll take a second here and we will look at a little clip about this. So in short, because Stalin is going to blockade Berlin, this means that there's no food or fuel or substance for survival for the Berliners. This is going to last 11 months. Right, the blockade is going to do. This really puts Truman in a position of how do we respond to this? Do we use force? That is something that could start a war. Do we abandon Berlin and kind of admit defeat? Or do you find a third option? What Truman is going to support, again, is this airlift that basically flying all of the necessary items for survival into Berlin. Extremely costly, but at the same time, it was this commitment to defend free people. Ultimately, Stalin is going to lift the blockade because his next move might be to shoot down these planes, and that could lead to war as well. And so that's something that neither side wanted to experience at this point. So this is an important moment because Truman in the United States and the West are basically saying, we're not going to be pushed around, we're not going to be bullied. We've got to make the stand right here. If the Allies were to abandon Berlin, this could encourage acts of aggression against other countries as well. So that was an important defining moment of the early Cold War. So in the wake of this confrontation, what we are also going to start to see are methods of trying to contain communism move a little bit beyond just providing economic aid that we've seen in the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. What we're going to see now is the development of this new alliance system. One is going to be called NATO, the other one is going to be called the Warsaw Pact. So NATO, again, is a mutual defense alliance. The idea of this is that if one nation is attacked, all of the other nations are going to respond. This is an important step for the United States because for the first time, it's now committing to defending European countries, which is something that historically, getting back to like the League of Nations and these obligations, the United States did not want to be obligated to participate in wars. NATO is a first important step in breaking with the United States' historic isolationism. As we also saw, that the Soviet Union is going to later develop their form of NATO. This is called the Warsaw Pact. And it really has the same premise as NATO. If any of those countries are attacked, all of these other countries are going to respond in kind. So as the US and the Soviets have now committed to defending other nations, another important aspect of the Cold War is this developing arms race that is going to emerge. What we're looking at here is a chart showing us the number of nuclear warheads that the United States and the Soviets have developed over time. We can see that the United States early on has quite the edge in terms of the amount of nuclear weapons that are there, but the Soviet Union is trying to do the best that it can to catch up to that. So what this is also going to mean is not just how many that you build. You have to do a lot of testing to think about different types of designs. We also are entering into the thermonuclear era as the bombs or weapons are becoming much more powerful. Here is the photograph of the hydrogen bomb. And then we also have to consider new ways to deliver these devices. So we're looking at innovations of longer range bombers, missiles and rockets, and longer range missiles. This is called an ICBM, or an intercontinental ballistic missile. And it seemed that the United States was really maintaining this sense of superiority throughout much of the 1950s. However, in 1957, the Soviet Union is going to launch this little beeping ball into orbit that is going to really frighten the United States. So with these military alliances, or defensive alliances, I guess we should say, that have emerged in the late 40s and the mid 1950s, what we can also see is that many of the tensions with respect to the Cold War are going to start to calm down a little bit, especially with things going on in Europe. But that doesn't mean that the Cold War itself is beginning to calm down. There are some other hot spots that are going to flare up around the world. So the focus of the Cold War is going to start to shift maybe away from things going on in Europe, and is then going to move over here to Asia. So there are some important developments that now we are going to examine in just a second. So in China specifically, right? So they've been experiencing a civil war that's been off and on and off and on. In the 1930s, there was a civil war that was going on between the Nationalist Party and the Communists. And then when World War II broke out and Japan is going to occupy areas of China, the civil war is put on pause and both sides are going to commit to fighting the Japanese. Once World War II comes to an end and Japan, their presence leaves China, the Civil War is going to resume. When we look at the sides here, what we're seeing are the nationalists, right, by Jiang Jiechi or Chiang Kai-shek, and they're going to be supported largely by the United States, right? So the U.S., even during World War II, was supporting this leader and their government to defend against Japanese aggression. But at the same time, they were not the most popular group with the people of China. And when we look at their military leadership, well, we can see that they were ineffective, corrupt, and really did not have a lot of great morale. What seems to be gaining a lot of traction in China at this time is Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, who are going to be aided by the Soviets. And their focus is to liberate China from the party that maybe has been holding them back, right? And so it's going to build tremendous amount of public support, especially from the peasants in China. Ultimately, the United States is going to send a lot of aid to the nationalists, but ultimately it's not going to be able to stop the advances of the communists. And in 1949, the communists are going to declare victory. They're going to gain control over these areas. We can kind of see the shades of blue that are moving in, and the nationalists are going to retreat to Taiwan. And so now we're in a place where there are two Chinas, the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. This is now going to fall into the orbit of the Cold War, as the Cold War powers are going to be involved in providing aid. The United States is actually not going to officially recognize Communist China. What the United States is going to recognize is that the Nationalist Party living in exile is the legitimate government of China. And this is something that is going to really prevent China from having the diplomatic influence. that they might otherwise have. And this is something will come up a little bit later. However, when we look at the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong is now declaring this new mandate of heaven. Basically, what he is stating is that, well, we've gotten rid of this old leadership that really failed to protect the people from their problems. And so now that we are here in this party, this new set of ideas is going to, bring peace, it's going to rebuild, and it's going to lead China to greatness. So what were some of the things that are now going to change in China as a result of the communist revolution? So the main goal is to restore China as this powerful nation. And so what we're going to see here are very much communist influence or Marxist influence ideas as to really push the economy more towards a communist one. So the redistribution of land, the communal, style of farming that is going to develop. There were many people who resisted these changes, and many of them were executed. It's also going to nationalize industries, meaning that they are all going to become government owned at that. And it's going to implement Soviet style plans as a means to improve the economy. The first one that we're going to look at here is called the Great Leap Forward. So to summarize what we saw, the Great Leap Forward was an attempt to rapidly industrialize through extensive government planning. What we saw there were the large collectives of farms for the peasants. However, this did not turn out to be very successful, as there were crop failures and other issues that are going to lead to the deaths of about 20 million people. And also the industries that were kind of pushed along were not the most successful in terms of the type of product that they were making. So we'll leave that for you to decide. Was this a great leap forward? In the wake of that, what we are going to see are new types of policies that is going to try to resolve some of these issues, or maybe the shortcomings of the Great Leap Forward. A couple of other notable things to point out at this time, that by this point, there have been tensions between China and the Soviets. There's a little bit of competition here as to who the great communist power is going to be. Mao is actually going to reduce his role in the government, which is going to allow for others to bring in maybe less than communist types of policies. So we're looking at maybe things of working for profit and kind of being more incentivized by the ability of individuals to succeed a little bit more. Mao was not happy about this direction that many of these new policies were going, which is going to usher in another wave of change that is known as the Cultural Revolution. So this attempt to revive communist policies to achieve equality between peasants and workers really being the ultimate goal here. He's going to use the youth to lead this cultural revolution. They were the militias referred to as the Red Guards. We saw a couple of things happening there. Many of the schools were ordered to shut down. Things like intellectual and artistic activity were deemed useless and dangerous. So all sorts of things were done to remove these olds, or the older way or traditional way of doing things. And in the long run, consider this to be more destructive to the Chinese sense of history and their culture. So a few things that we've examined today: that China certainly has undergone a lot of changes in the post-World War II era and has also experienced a lot of challenges. But let's not forget, they are going to become one of the bigger powers in the region. And they're going to remind the United States of this, especially in the 1950s with their involvement in the Korean War, and in the 1960s with China's role in making things a little bit complicated for the United States in the Vietnam War. But we will save that for another time. So just a little bit of a wrap up for us today. Some of the big ideas: that the opposing economic and political philosophies of the United States and the Soviet Union led to this global competition that became known as the Cold War. Again, Cold War, it's referred to this as more to explain the tensions or hostilities. There was no direct fighting between the two powers, but certainly that sense of competition is going to be there. In addition to that, after World War II, Chinese communists defeated the nationalist forces, and two separate Chinas emerged and experienced these growing pains as they are trying to catch up with the modern world. So please be aware that this is going to be the last lesson of this unit. There is going to be a test next block. So I would encourage you to look over your notes, look over the blueprint, and also access that Quizlet and to use those as a study aid. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day.